Squawk Box this morning, the debt ceiling fight sucking up so much of the oxygen in Washington for the last month. Now that a deal is done, Congress moving on other battles over spending and taxes. Joining us right now, Senator John Thune of South Dakota. The senator serves as Minority Whip, making him the #2 Republican in the Senate. We're thrilled to have you at the table without a blazer on, no less.
You did it for us.
Did it for us. Wanted to act the part.
Want to fit in.
Nice to see you.
You can pull it off. Not everyone looks so great.
He does look good in it without the blazer.
Yeah.
Help us understand what you think is now officially on the agenda that was effectively off the table for at least the last month and a half as everybody was focused on the debt ceiling.
Everything was balled up behind the debt ceiling vote. There are a few things that have to get done that will be bipartisan. The Farm Bill is something we do every 4 or 5 years. It's a big piece of legislation. The current Farm Bill expires September 30th. And so there'll be a lot of focus on trying to get that going. You know, if we don't get it done on time, we do an extension, which isn't a good thing. So you want to get that done. FAA reauthorization is another big issue we do every 4 or 5 years. A lot's changed in the aviation world in the last 4 or 5 years, so that's something that should be bipartisan. And then the Democrats have their agenda. You know, if you listen to Schumer, it's going to be pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs, something on rail safety regulation, something on AI. He's got kind of his to-do list. And then there's just a normal process of moving appropriation bills. Now that we have a cap established under this deal last week, now we have to try and get down and do individual bills. So it could be a very busy summer and fall.
How messy? Just the appropriations itself.
How messy?
Yeah, given that you have a cap.
Yeah, it's always very messy, and now you've got to try and figure out underneath how do you allocate funds in each of the categories and where are you going to make the decisions about where money gets spent. And, you know, as you all know, last week's deal just dealt with basically the discretionary side of the budget. So it plussed up defense, not as much as some people wanted, and ramped down non-defense discretionary spending, but didn't touch any of the mandatory part of the budget, which represents about 2/3, 70% of all spending. So it's a small amount that we're talking about, but for the first time in a decade, we're actually directionally, decreasing or the size of government instead of expanding it.
Question: you are the ranking member of the subcommittee on taxation and IRS oversight, and we talk about the IRS constantly. In this last go-round on the debt ceiling issue, the IRS budget was reduced. Are you happy about that?
I am. I mean, I think a lot of the IRS, the ramp up in spending, which included not only the Inflation Reduction Act last August, but if the president had his way, his budget had another 29% increase on top of that. You're talking about $80 billion in new money, 87,000 new employees, most of which, or large percentage of which, were allocated toward enforcement.
The criticism of the deal that was arrived at doesn't do nearly enough for what Republicans want to do to the IRS.
Well, no, I understand that, but the question that I understand.
And you're not finished trying to kind of.
But the question that I would ask is, where do you land on enforcement? Do you think the taxes shouldn't be enforced?
No, I think they should, and I think there's an argument to be made that the IRS needed some additional resources and manpower in that area. But it was so excessive relative to what, if you look at how much was allocated to taxpayer services, which is where the IRS has really dropped the ball. You know, you had a couple of years ago, they were only getting about 1 in 10 calls answered from people calling into the IRS. And they have made these assumptions, the Democrats have, that if you put this amount of money into enforcement, you're going to generate all this.
You're going to collect a lot more revenue, right?
And there's probably a certain amount. I wouldn't deny the fact that a certain amount of additional revenue can be generated if you up compliance, but it's nowhere close to what their expectation is. If you look at tax compliance, it's pretty close to what it's been for the last several decades.
Right. The right, the left, both carping, obviously, and some people would say that's a good thing. The far right, most upset that there wasn't more done in terms of the IRS. We had Speaker McCarthy on. He's like, I get this done, and now all I'm hearing is, wow, more Democrats voted for this than Republicans. There must be a reason for that. Do you think he got a lot accomplished?
I think he played the hand that he was dealt pretty well. I mean, remember, Democrats control 2/3 of Washington. They have the White House and the Senate. We have the House of Representatives, and by a very narrow majority. He managed to execute on getting not only a bill through initially, but then the second time in negotiations with the White House, something that for the first time in a decade actually ramps down discretionary spending and increases defense without growing government, expanding any programs or tax increases. That's pretty remarkable given the constraints that he has to do.
True or false? We have enough revenue and we need to live within our means.
True. Yeah. I mean,
so there's a lot coming in. So it's a spending, because you're going to hear that there were no taxes involved with this deal. That's what we got to talk about in the budget. You saw the president's budget. It was like just all tax increases.
When you said there's enough revenue.
Yeah, there's enough revenue.
Hold on.
Record revenue.
I'm asking our guests. You said there's enough revenue. Explain that to me when we're spending way beyond our means. So now you could argue, do you believe that you could actually balance the budget properly without doing great damage to our society if you were to be able to balance the budget based on the revenue number we're getting today?
Well, I think you balance it, one, by constraining spending, and that doesn't deal with just the discretionary part of the budget. You've got to start looking at how do we make entitlement programs more sustainable.
No, I understand
so that. And then you got to couple that with growth. So you need pro-growth policies that increase the amount of the pie. But to your point, I mean, I think what you're getting at, Andrew, is that, yes, we're spending too much relative to what we're taking in. But if you look at what we're taking in historically, as a percentage of the GDP.
But as a percentage of GDP relative to other developed countries, we're actually on a ratio basis remarkably low on the list now.
That's why we're able to grow faster than all those other countries historically, 30-40% faster.
In a free market economy, you want to have incentives out there. You want to have a light regulatory touch. And I think too often, the Democrat focus on growing government as opposed to growing the economy. If you want to improve the lives of people in this country, grow the economy, and that means you've got to have the right tax policy and incentives to invest. And you shouldn't be looking at, gee, how much can we get revenue as a percentage of GDP? You ought to look at what we can be doing in terms of growth.
You've thought